the pen talks at the very wonderful Oaxaca Day of the Dead Festival. We're running talks all through the day and into the early evening with some of the very finest writers and artists, musicians, journalists, actors from Mexico and the UK. So I hope that you'll stay for this, obviously, and you'll come back for more later. I'm delighted now to welcome Simon Schama, Homero Aridjis, and Gaby Wood. Gaby is now the director of the Booker Prize Foundation. She was previously the books editor of The Telegraph, a journalist with The Observer, and she's a writer herself. And she combines everything just within herself, in fact, because she has a Mexican mother, and she spent part of her childhood in Mexico, so she's living proof of bridging the divide. Please welcome Gaby Wood, Simon Schama, and Homero Aridjis.
Thank you. I thought you said living proof of bridging and divide there. Well, that's definitely more like it, more the divide. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here moderating. And you'll see that you'll need me, because I'm about to introduce to you two men of absolutely immoderate intelligence. Great thinkers and great friends, actually, as I discovered. On my far left is Simon Schama, who you will all know, if not personally know of, the great, groundbreaking and very eloquent historian. He's a historian of art, nature, politics. Many of you will be familiar, of course, with his books on the French Revolution, on Rembrandt, more recently on the history of the Jews, and I'm sure you will have seen his very recent, in fact, just finished series on the history of portraiture in Britain on the BBC, The Face of Britain. Next to him is Homero Aridjis, you may be less familiar with, a great Mexican poet, essayist, novelist, and also environmentalist. He is a very important critic of what is going on in Mexico just now, which we will come to later, I think. He's been Mexican ambassador to Holland, to Switzerland, and to UNESCO in Paris, and he's also been president of PEN International. So both of you are very welcome here. Please give them another round. So we were trying to think of, there are many points of continuity and communion between these two, but we were trying to think of ways of structuring it so that they would be evident to you. I think one thing we might talk about is landscape and the sense of place. And Homero, perhaps you might like to start with reading one of your poems. Homero has a poem about the monarch butterflies. If it's all right, he'll read it in Spanish, and then he's asked me to read the translation, so listen to him first.
This poem to a monarch butterfly was inspired. This is the natural landscape of my childhood in a small village in Mexico, and has been along my life like a permanent presence and motivation in the defense of the environment. When I became involved in the environmental cause, as the founder of the Group of 100, all the time I had an image of this monarch butterfly flying from Canada across the United States to this small village in Mexico. That for me has been a permanent presence and a symbol of life, fragile life in the planet. First I read it in Spanish, and Gaby is going to read it in English. A una mariposa monarca, tú que vas por el día como un tigre alado, quemándote en tu vuelo, dime, ¿qué vida sobrenatural está pintada en tus alas para que después de esta vida pueda verte en mi noche?
To a monarch butterfly, you who go through the day like a winged tiger, burning as you fly, tell me what supernatural life is painted on your wings, so that after this life I may see you in my night. You speak there, well, you were speaking just before about the effect of the natural world on you, and I suppose on your writing life. Can you describe a little bit for people the place where you grew up?
Yes. Well, it was a small village in Mexico, in central Mexico, and this small village was blessed by the winter presence of the monarch butterflies coming from Canada across the Rocky Mountains, the United States, against through the rain, the winds, and all kinds of dangers, to spend the winter in Mexico, in these Mexican sanctuaries, in the Cerro Altamirano Hill, that for me has been the symbol also of life. And when I was one of the first to mention this butterfly when I was writing a book, a child poet, and was the presence almost hundreds of millions of butterflies flying across the streets of the village, like rivers of butterflies, in the good times, in the good years, and covering the trees, the sky with the fly. And then later became a problem because deforestation, destruction of the environment, and loggers and all that. Then my wife and me started the group of 100. We were defending the forest, and we fought for the official decree to protect the monarch butterfly in Mexico. And there were declared 5 sanctuaries. And when I was ambassador to UNESCO, I have a goal that was to get from the UNESCO to declare the sanctuaries the reserve natural heritage of humanity. And the Mexican government was not very sure that they wanted, because once they are declared, they have a commitment to do it. And I have to go almost alone with the committee of 21 countries to support the nomination of the monarch butterflies, and we got it. But then it's like now the monarch butterflies is arriving to Mexico in these days. Usually they said that the monarch butterflies were the soul of the dead people, were coming to the hills, to the cemeteries, and staying to live like the spirits of the ancestors. And then as the presence in the Day of the Dead is really important of the monarch butterflies.
Is it because of the coincidence of the Day of the Dead and when they arrive that well, I was going to call it a superstition, perhaps it's true, that belief arose?
Exactly, yes. When you visit cemetery, as such I visit the cemetery of my village, and always you have the butterflies flying among the graves, and the people were bringing flowers to the relatives dead, etc. And there was very familiar, and also crossing the street of the village to go to the hill. Then for us was a relation between the butterflies and the souls of the dead people. And then for now, for example, in my mind, while I am speaking to you, I have the image of these butterflies in the cemetery, in the hill, flying around.
Yes. Beautiful. Perhaps that's why there's so much orange out here on the Day of the Dead, the monarch butterflies come. Simon, you wrote this very important book, Landscape and Memory, which, when I was looking at the date of it, I realised it's its 20th anniversary now.
Oh, so it is.
Tell us more about how that came about. I mean, you've written about...
I just want to say, apropos of Homera's lovely picture of the arrival of butterflies, I think I would feel better about autumn, which is a season I absolutely hate. Sorry, John Keats. That's because I live in upstate New York, and last year in particular, the winter was sort of sent to us by the ghosts of the Third Reich. It was so vile and malevolent and every day. It was like being stabbed in the face. And I feel much better about autumn if it was about arrivals. But, where I live, in the Northern Hemisphere, it's all about departures. Everything is, the swallows go, then the geese go. Actually, the geese around where I live, just 30 miles outside New York, they pretend to go, and they circle back to the golf courses where they squat and celebrate their capacity of fouling the fairways. Really good for them too. So Canada geese actually. So Landscape and Memory. I call it my sort of lorry book, as in trucks and lorries, because, and I'll say a little bit about how it came to be. It came to me kind of backwards, like most of the interesting things I might do, it sort of comes upon me accidentally. But it was one book, the reason I call it a truck book is I said to myself that 20-something years ago, it took a long time to write that book actually, it was the most painful book in terms of getting the balance of storytelling and argument right. My family were just about ready to give up on me, you know. Homero knows how long-suffering they are, but I was incredibly bad-tempered. But it's because the lorry thing, because I thought if you're setting across the street and a lorry's coming round the corner with your name on it, and you're destined to go under the wheels, it's a good dead story, really. What is it that you haven't yet written that you say, oh bugger, you know, if only I'd written that? And that was Landscape and Memory, and I knew I needed to write a landscape book. Everything else was okay, kind of optional, but this one I really had to do. And I suppose it was because it came about backwards through doing all those books about the Dutch, and that where, in fact, there are two things, you can't possibly write about the Netherlands unless you're visually alert and sensitive. You know, a book about the Netherlands, there are plenty of them. Just using texts are not going to tell even half the story. But also, it was a culture which physically made in a very kind of hostile and dangerous flood world a place to sort of settle and feel safe and be permanent, and a huge amount arose out of that. And you know, the first chapter of The Embarrassment of Aridjis is about the so-called drowning cell, the place where the lazy were incarcerated in Amsterdam, and taps were turned on, and they were given a small hand pump, and unless they pumped very hard all the time, they would drown. So I was making analysis between that and the way it was to be Dutch. So I finished that book and went on tour, and it was I was in Germany in November. I mean, I guess it was exactly 20 years ago. Fog shrouded, one of the most terrifying, talk about Day of the Dead, fog-shrouded autobahns being driven by a mostly drunk Serbian driver, which was beyond terrifying. You went into some sort of astral black hole of beyond fear. And I then, I remember ending up at Munich with a terrible kind of, I think I was going down with flu, and my publisher's way of coping with my low spirits, mixture of exhaustion and terror, was to have a stupendously alcohol-fueled party. And the next morning I felt even worse, and he said, Carl, you know, heal me. And so he took me to a kind of restaurant, and he said, what you want is Leber, this is so not Mexican, but Leber Knödelsuppe, which is sort of broth with tiny, tiny dumplings, you know, suspended in it, and you stare at it, and your spoon chases around the bath for the occasional dumpling. But I did feel good. So I gradually blood started to circulate a little more effectively around metabolism. And I looked up, and everywhere were women in loden coats, hairy and sylvan, as in the forest, with birds that appeared to have arrived on their heads, you know, with sort of birdie plume hats. And with a sort of act of fantastic churlishness with which I'm still ashamed, I said, what is it with you Germans and the woods? It was so rude of me, really. And he said, oh, well, now there's a book, actually. So the landscape memory started from that. And I discovered, you know, like a sort of chump, but it is interesting in terms of our discussion about this particular bit of subject.
Simon, I would like to ask you if when the landscape of memory becomes the landscape of dreams, for example, this metamorphosis very subtle when these landscapes become integrated to your head and are transformed into dreams. There is an art or in culture that at this moment you can notice, or it's a normal transformation.
Yeah. You mean actually when I was writing it, or actually as a subject?
As a
subject. Well, the book was rather about that, Homero.
Yes.
I guess actually in terms of why the Germans were obsessed with their origins in the wood.
Yes, exactly.
Or what the English version of the greenwood meant.
Yes.
I wouldn't describe it as dreams, actually, so much as, you know,
obsessions.
Yes, obsessions. Exactly. Myths and obsessions
Yes.
and fables around which, and you know, your question is absolutely perfect. So it's the conditioning way in which we place certain value on different kinds of, in your case, the monarch butterfly. You know, I had a long thing about the Thames and the place of the partly because I was an estuary boy when I was growing up. But you know, different kinds of cultures build themselves around their imagined perceptions of different kinds of landscapes. That's quite true.
Well, Homero, you were talking earlier about mythic landscape as well, which is part of this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And let me ask you, I mean, is this reflective of your experience of Holland, for instance? I mean, since you lived in the Netherlands for so long.
6 years.
Yeah.
Well, the perception of Holland was like, I read to the conclusion that the clouds are the mountains of Holland. And it's something that the Dutch are missing all the time, mountains, but they have in exchange clouds all the time. Then there's this kind of perception, even the light is filtered through clouds.
Yeah.
In Mexico, the light comes directly to you. You feel the light in your body, not only the perception in your eyes, but also in your skin. Then it's a kind of warm light all the time. And I became a solar poet also, because if you are in Mexico, you become a solar poet.
Yeah. There is a wonderful book by Sees Notenberg. Do you know Sees?
Yes, I know.
He was a novelist.
I know.
Called The Mountains of Holland.
Well, that's very good.
Yeah.
Probably told him that
Yeah,
once he came to Mexico.
Oh, you probably did. Yeah. But that's a wonderful observation. The painter who immediately comes to mind is Jacob van Rijsdel, who is the great painter of symphonically majestic clouds hanging over Haarlem and over the North Sea. But he also paints, you know, quite low hills, and he alters the steepness. So famously, the castle at Bentheim, which Van Rijsdel does many times, is faked. It's actually a rather squat little mound on which it's got. But in Rijsdel's, he makes it much more mountainous.
And the mountains sometimes are invented mountains, like Patinir, the painter, this kind of blocks of, like, they look like blocks of ice, and also very blue. It's very fantastic blue in the Patinir landscape.
Yes, the hunger for height. It happens in Peter Brevel as well. In some of those, there's on the one hand, down below in the background of Peter Brevel's two of his famous season paintings, there are Dutch Flemish skaters, but they're seen from these extravagantly pinnacle-like peaks. That is absolutely quite true. What Rijsdel does, I mean, I think precisely because, you know, think about computer photos, everything in Dutch landscape has been so horizontal. He's one of the first people to create portrait landscapes, which are formats the other way around.
A lot of the landscapes in the Renaissance painting is more than a natural landscape. Sometimes it's invented landscape, even in the cities. It's transformed into painting in plastic blocks, etc.
Right. All landscapes are, or very often, you know, the number of painters who are actually country folk are tiny. They're essentially urban fantasies. The first landscapes of all, other than the ones in Thera and Santorini, are Chinese landscapes in the 9th century. And they're all done by Mandarin scholars 500 miles away from these amazing peaks that they're actually doing in hand scrolls with a single Taoist monk disembodying himself amidst the clouds. It's all kind of urban entertainment.
No, and the mountains in the Chinese painting, the human size or the presence is small because nature and the cosmos is big, and the human figure is very insignificant in the landscape. It's almost philosophical, and a perception of the insignificance of the human existence.
I wanted to say, Homero, that still unprepared landscape, that when I began to write landscape of memory, I discovered that one thinks in terms of history, except for great Robert Macfarlane and the other people as well, that you can't write the history of landscape. History, as a profession, is a history of what people do. This, of course, is absolutely not true. There are an enormous number of things. And what you discover, it's a especially strong tradition in America, from Francis Parkman onwards, but very strong since the Second World War, is a very poetically augmented style of writing. There's a brilliant historian of the environment called Stephen Pine, a great name, but P-Y-N-E, who's a professor at the University of Arizona at Tempe, and there was a fireman in the Grand Canyon, is one of his lines, and he's written histories of fire. But the book that I always tell people to read, you should all read out there, I think it's still in print, it's called The Ice, and it's a history of Antarctica. And it begins with a description of different kinds. There was Smiller's sense of snow. I'm sure she stole it from Stephen. Instead of snow, there's a description in the most poetically high-pitched language, entire page of different kinds of ice, from floating pack ice to what he calls the dome. And there was this extraordinary tradition of poetically intensified historical writing in America, much more profound and more powerful than writing in this country, I think.
Well, the eyes are very important. The eyes actually.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about sort of poetry as history, or history as poetry? I mean, the uses of poetry, or different ways of thinking about poetry. I mean, you do specifically write poems, but has your poetic sensibility led you to think in a certain way about politics, say?
Yes, exactly. I have written 3 historical novels, but they have been very interesting because the way you can get a historic period or the human mind is through language, through literature, because besides the historic documents, you have to go through the literature of the period. And it's the daily documents, or the way people, even to go to the market with people. And then it's the only possibility you can go. And when I was writing 1492, it was about the Jews in Spain in the 15th century.
For those of you who don't know, it's the year of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain.
Yes, let's come to this. And that book was called 1492, The Life and Times of Juan Cabezón de Castilla, right, which is a book written in 1985. Yes, published in Spanish in 1985.
And English also.
And in English later, yeah. Go ahead, sorry. So,
well, when I was so immersed in the period that I was fighting between writing and investigation, etc. But suddenly I had dreams in the synagogue of Toledo, talking with the people, the conversos of the time, and dreaming with them. I saw their faces. And it was very strange because it was like translating myself into a period of time. And was the only way to get the spirit of the historic moment. And I began to write about Christopher Columbus, 1492, but later the period was more interesting to write about the Inquisition in 1492, and I got a character called Isabel de la Vega, who was persecuted by the Inquisition across Spain, and also at the time was a terrible character called Torquemada. Then was the monster of Inquisition at the time, and it was very a coincidence when Christopher Columbus was leaving Spain to go in the 3 boats, that the Jews were expelled very, very close in Puerto Santa Maria, almost at the same time. Yes.
Well, yes, I mean, and you've written about the expulsion of the Jews. You've written this great 2-part history of the Jews. Would you want to talk about that from your point
Part
of
2
view?
is being written as we speak,
Yeah.
but will be, I'm trying to finish it by the spring, so it should be out this time next year. Well, actually, it is profound and terrible, tragic, horror, actually, and I don't really want to, except I want to say that the moment of absolute horror happens 100 years before the actual expulsion in the 1390s, when something like 100,000 Jews are killed in a matter of 3 years for resisting forced conversion. And then the community of Jews in Spain, which have been there before Christianity had arrived, goes back to pagan Visigothic period, are then divided into thirds, 1/3 who accepts conversion, 1/3 who remain dangerously but defiantly Jewish, and 1/3 who are ostensibly Christian but secret Marranos. So, and the 100 years between the savage pogroms, as one anachronistically calls them, of the 1380s and 1390s, are all directed against Marranos, who ostensibly are Christians. And we talk about the Inquisition as though it happened to everybody. It happened in very limited numbers to the Moriscos, to Muslims in Granada, but it happened about 85–90% only to Jews. It was essentially an anti-Semitic hysteria of absolutely. Anyway, now if you happen to be part of the culture that trace your lineage back to that expelled, you're, thanks but no thanks really, you're allowed to apply for Spanish citizenship.
Well, yes, and how does this work? This is interesting. In some ways, you see the traces of these things now, as you're saying, Homero, and then and they, they return, in fact, sort of literally, or like there's some form of apology. But in other ways, you were saying earlier that in other places you actually can't get history from walking, the legwork won't do it because it's been erased. You were talking about the French Revolution, for instance.
Yeah, well, I'd say that when we filmed the story of the Jews, there are basically 2 synagogues left, because nearly all of them, all over Spain, but particularly in Andalusia, and then in the area around Madrid, synagogues were razed and turned into churches. But two survived, one tiny one in Cordoba, and one very beautiful one indeed in Toledo as well. And that Toledo one is extremely moving to go and see, because it's a synagogue that was done actually for a Christian king by his Jewish financial counselor in the 14th century. And but it's done. The actual decoration is indistinguishable from a mosque. So it has exquisite, and indeed has calligraphy in Arabic as well as Hebrew and Roman characters. So it is a single kind of architectural palimpsest.
But I wanted to say something about the difference between the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and the war of reconquest.
Yeah.
Because the expulsion of the Jews from Spain was in 1492, and the expulsion of the Moors was in 1496, 4 years later, and was after the fall of Granada, because the Spaniards were fighting since the conquest of Spain by the Muslims in 711, and was almost 8 centuries of occupation of Spain, and also the war was very long. Then, but was not really the expulsion of the Moors came later, because first was the war against the Moors, and where they were defeated in 1492 almost, at the time of the expulsion of the Jews, the time of the discovery of America. Then was very interesting, because really the war against the Jews began by San Vicente Ferrer in the 15th century, because one of the difference between the conversos and the Jews was that the conversos were forced conversions into Christianity by Vicente Ferrer.
Is this the group you were talking about?
Yes, exactly.
Well, the conversos accepted conversion.
And the other was the Spanish was so-called, later became the ghetto, or the apartheid in South Africa was a word, the Spanish word called apartamiento, to apartar,
to set aside
the Jews from the conversos, and the Jews were living in apartamientos in apartheid. Was very interesting the difference, because was I was in Valencia, well, in Delhi, Valencia, and now Valencian writer was telling me about, he was called Vicente, and he said, I am called Vicente by some Vicente Ferrer, who was the one who was forcing massive conversion of the Jews.
Well, it's a horrible history, and actually the scenes are deeply tragic. For example, Jews were, during a period of forced conversion, were forced to sit there listening to Christian conversionary sermons on Shabbat, on Saturdays, and on the Day of Atonement. You had to show up, and you had to sit there, and the doors were literally kind of beaten down. And a Dominican or Franciscan friar would, sometimes it was a prince of the House of Love, would march up to the pulpit and scream at the congregation, salvation or death, you know. So, yeah, I mean, it's really, we are so preoccupied with the Holocaust, as, you know, no reason not to be in the Shoah. One actually forgets how grotesque atrocities were perpetrated long before the 20th century in these respects. No, I wanted to just switch the conversation a little bit because, you know, again, poetry and history may seem to be, you know, have no connection at all, but I was always drawn to poets, you know, Seamus Heaney, who I knew a bit, we were colleagues at Harvard, who were, you know, so saturated, in Seamus's case, almost in the, obviously, in the kind of peacock archaeology of Ireland, but there are, you know, so many great poets, essentially, who, but there are other reasons, really, why I've always felt that, actually, I tell my graduate students, the one sensibility that's indispensable to a really strong historian, even though we can never be it, or else we would be it, is a poetic sensibility. Two reasons, two quite different reasons, which Homero might not agree with. One is that the first historians in the Western tradition are declamatory. Herodotus was a rhapsode. Everything he wrote in that book was meant to be declaimed out loud. My own professor, when I was a student in Cambridge in the 60s, said to me, never forget, you're the descendant of Herodotus shouting in the marketplace, which that's why I shout. So.
Explains everything.
Yeah, it does really. But the sort of performative sense, you know, a rhapsode like Herodotus was required to, so it's very similar to the kind of declamation of Hesiod or Homer, was required to perform at Delphi and at Olympus at particular moments in the ancient Athenian calendar, and therefore exactly the things to which Thucydides took exception. Herodotus' fusion of myth and memory and fantasy with empirically discovered fact were exactly what he was, you know, about, and that's why, you know, the history of the wars between the Greeks and the Persians is immensely expansive and encyclopedic. Thucydides is wonderful, but his is really the political science of the past, and it's directed entirely into what is it about us Athenians that is so superior, but also so loaded with hubris. Herodotus was an Ionian gossip, you know, didn't come from Athens. He loved the kind of anthropological curiosities, as he thought of it, of the Persians and he has a real kind of poetic tone. And I mean, I came with this, I won't read them out, but I've always, you know, there are great historians. The last amazing, well, maybe I'll just read that, of Edward Gibbon. You don't think of Gibbon, really, as a poet. Or even Macaulay. I mean, I have Macaulay, this amazing chapter on Dryden, when Dryden is a kind of shifty figure amidst the circles of James II. But this is the, you know, from the famous end of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, where Gibbon, he's leading up, it's absolutely like a poetic essay, like one of yours, really, leading up to, you know, the end of this immense work. It describes the beginning of how, sitting amidst the ruins of the Forum, he conceives the idea. So as you get to the very end, you're in the 14th century. It's a kind of elegy of ruin. And it has this kind of sonority of declaimed history. And it also has the kind of visual precision of poetry. And here's the colonna. Here are the kind of the Roman youths of the 14th century making use of the ruins of the Colosseum. And the lots, this is about to have a kind of ferocious animal games. The lots of the champions were drawn by an old and respectable citizens, and they descended into the arena or pit to encounter the wild bulls on foot, as it should seem, with a single spear. Sounds like poetry, doesn't it? Amidst the crowd, our analysts selected the names, colours, and devices of 20 of the most conspicuous knights, the names of the most illustrious of Rome, the ecclesiastic and the state. And then follows just a poetically sonorous list. Malatesta, Polenta, Della Valle, Caffarello, Savelli, Capoccio, Conti, Anibaldi, Altieri, Corsi, colours adapted to their taste, devices expressive of hope or despair, breathing the spirit of gallantry and arms. I am alone like the youngest of the Horatii, the confidence of an intrepid stranger. I live disconsolate, a weeping widower. These are all the devices on the shields. I burn beneath the ashes, a discreet lover. I adore Lavinia or Lucretia, and so on. This is the most, we think of as the most kind of prosaic of all historians, the most rational of all 18th century historians. He's just drowning in a flood of poetic rapture.
Lyricism.
That's great.
Let's give it.
This is fantastic. I think it might be time to punctuate it with a poem of yours, Homero. Would you like to read the self-portrait?
Okay.
This is speaking about the other Homer.
Es autorretrato a los 54 años. Soy Homero Aridjis, nací en Contepec, Michoacán, tengo 54 años, esposa y 2 hijas. En el comedor de mi casa tuve mis primeros amores, Dickens, Cervantes, Shakespeare y el otro Homero. Un domingo en la tarde, Frankenstein salió del cine del pueblo y a la orilla de un arroyo le dio la mano a un niño, que era yo. El Prometeo, formado con retazos humanos, siguió su camino, pero desde entonces, por ese encuentro con el monstruo, el verbo y el horror son míos.
Self-portrait at 54 years old. I am Homero Aridjis. I was born in Contepec, Michoacán. I am 54 with a wife and 2 daughters. In the dining room of my house, I had my first loves, Dickens, Cervantes, Shakespeare, and the other Homer. One Sunday afternoon, Frankenstein came out of the town movie house and on a stream's bank held out his hand to a boy who was me. The Prometheus, pieced out of human remnants, went on his way, but since then, out of that encounter with the monster, the verb and the horror are mine. Very nice. Tell us a bit about that, about how a boy in Contepec discovers Dickens and Homer and, and Frankenstein.
Well, I had like 3 very important trips in my small village that was so small that when I asked me the size of my village, I said it's bigger than London, Paris, and New York. And people said, oh, this man must be crazy. And I said, yes, it's bigger than these cities because it's so small that it begins and ends in the sky. Because it was surrounded by the sky. And that was my village. But I had many trips reading like the Odyssey by Homer, and I read there Hamlet, and also Dickens. I began to read David Copperfield, and was like months and months and months of reading when I was a teenager. And Cervantes, of course, was Don Quixote, was crossing the fields and the mountains of my village. Then I was very, very imaginative, and I thought that the characters were there. But and I began to write in the dining room of my house, and in a very private, secretive way, and putting the poems just for myself. And that was very important. The but my father had a movie house called Cine Apollo. My father was a Greek exile and fought against the Turks in 1922, lost the war, and he came to Mexico. Then he was the only Greek in the area that he couldn't speak his language anymore. He's here to Mexico. But in the movies, we had a double program every weekend with a Mexican film and American film. And for us, for me, this was a way to see the world. And of course, the English tradition of monsters, because it's very English, Frankenstein, Dracula.
Dracula's Irish.
Irish, but there's was the imagination and the Anglo-Saxon movie industry, etc., was very alive. And these monsters were, I saw the monster walking in the village, and that was like that. It was very important, this kind of literature and films.
It's very, I have a sort of analogy to it. What is it about Dickens? It's amazing, really, because Dickens was, and by the way, just as a digression, I have a wonderful colleague at Columbia, my art history department, where I'm at, Ross Krauss, who had a really violent stroke about 10 years ago, maybe a bit less, but 7 or 8 years ago. And she recovered brilliantly. And she said, actually, when she started language to come back, she was still very tentative about it. And the only thing she wanted to read was Dickens, which you would think it'd be something the most, Emily Dickinson's poems, something very stripped down and simple. She said no, she wanted the full, unending extravagance of Dickens, which actually, a real workout for the kind of wiring between brain and speech. But my father used to read Dickens to us out loud on Sunday afternoons, every week when my sister and I were, my sister was much older than me. And only as I got older, I realized, because I was at school in the late 50s and 60s, that Dickens was kind of banned, basically, by the tyranny of Dr. Leibniz and his disciples. The only Dickens novel that you were supposed to approve of was the most boring one, namely Hard Times. And so memory of my father wallowing in Nicholas Nickleby and Great Expectations and doing all the voices, was a fantastic gift because it was precisely formless and abundant and infinite and of the earth and the guts and, just the delight passed through one's whole being, just as a list of Dickens's names, their absurdity and their extravagance, their theatricality was part of it, really.
For us, was the attraction of the orphans. For example, when I was a teenager, that was David Copperfield, Oliver Twist, all these characters that represent the orphan and the child in trouble.
Children are everywhere.
Poverty,
and it's very scary. I mean,
exactly.
The appearance of language is unbelievably, threatening to tear Pip's liver out. Is unbelievably scary. The whole, Do the Boys Hall is not funny. It's absolutely fucking terrifying.
Well, there was something about, for example, that make it similar to us as Mexican children, the fear to be a lost child. That also is taking the subject William Blake, but before, but was like this kind of vulnerability of the child, and always the tribulations of an orphan child, and that was probably the major attraction for us as teenagers to read Dickens.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm suddenly seeing a link between Dickens and Buñuel, Los Olvidados, in a way that hadn't appeared before. You must have read it slightly later because you were older and also reading it in Spanish.
In Spanish, of course.
And who translated it into Spanish? What were
I
they
don't
like?
remember. I read every edition, but the attraction was David Copperfield. And as a matter of fact, we met Luis Buñuel, the director of Los Olvidados, and my daughter Eva make a film called Children of the Street. And they put it together with Los Olvidados about this kind of poor child, lost in the big cities, exploited, abused, suffering, and falling in drugs, all these kind of things. And she made the more or less the actual landscape of the poor child in Mexico City, because there are hundreds of thousands of children of the street in the country. Every city has 20,000, 30,000 of children of the street.
Yeah, we should talk a little bit about the situation in Mexico now. Do you want to read one last poem?
Yes.
Not actually written about Mexico City,
No.
but relevant to
Yes.
what you might say later.
Well, because in the violence in Mexico that is taking the country, I don't want the country to have that every day is a day of the dead, because usually we have victims every day, and for us it's like day of the dead every day in the country. And this was impressious because, especially because abuse and killings of women, feminicidios, what they call at the border, that there they say, if in Ciudad Juárez, a city in the north of Mexico, they say, if you are young and you are beautiful and you are poor, this is a sentence of death for these women, for the young women. En tiempos de violencia hay ángeles que vuelan sobre las calles desoladas como si llevaran alas en los pies. Con terminales de rayos en las manos se configuran en los antros del alba en busca de la materia gris de gente ejecutada. Corriendo por las carreteras alarmados, no traen ropajes ni joyas celestiales, ni caras fulgurantes, ni voces musicales. Se sabe que están allí por una huella dorada o por los dedos transparentes que acarician una boca, una teta ensangrentada. Escapan de los retenes militares y de las esposas de los policías federales acurrucados en el rincón de un baño o del closet donde hay gato encerrado, saltan como una sombra para dar agua a los ametrallados. Con almohadas rellenas de nada, recorren los basureros de la madrugada donde reposa la cabeza de la mujer violada. En tiempos de violencia hay ángeles en esta nada.
In violent times. In violent times there are angels who fly over the desolate streets as if wearing wings on their feet. They turn up in the dives at daybreak with blades of light at the ends of their fingers, searching out the grey matter of murdered people. Alarmed and racing along the highways, they wear no robes nor celestial jewellery, no glowing countenance, no musical voices. One learns that they are from a golden footprint or transparent fingers stroking a mouth, a bloodied breast. They escape the military roadblocks, the handcuffs of the federal police, huddle in the corner of a bathroom, or where there's a skeleton in a closet. They spring like a shadow to give those mown down water. Bearing pillows stuffed with nothing, they scour the garbage dumps of dawn, where lies the head of a raped woman. In violent times, there are angels in this nothingness. Well, yes, we should talk about the violent times. What more is there to say now? I mean, I feel that particularly after a year after Ayotzinapa, you know, is there a risk that people will forget this, or that nothing has moved on, or what is your view? Living in Mexico, what do you feel needs to be said now?
Well, after the 1 year of the killings of the Ayotzinapa students, 43 students who disappeared, and we know that they were executed because there was like a connection with the drug traffickers. Not because the students were drug traffickers, but because they discovered a fifth boss. The students kidnapped 5 bosses to be taken away to other places, etc. It's a custom of the Mexican students to kidnap bosses with a driver and to tell them, take me to the city, to this place, etc. But by bad luck, the 5 bosses they were taking, they took a field bus that was loaded with drugs and was heroin. And this was more or less the area from Iguala city. This made the route to Chicago, across Mexico, crossing the border, probably with the complicity of the American authorities also, and arriving to Chicago with drugs. That is the center of distribution of heroin.
Was that known before? I mean, that came up.
Now.
Yeah.
Now, because nobody can explain why they killed the students.
Yeah.
And poor students, also there was a social crime, because most of these students were poor. Many times, the terrible thing was, for example, a father said, the only child in my family who had more or less certain education and certain intelligence was killed. The only student in the family, because were like families of peasants, and there was almost like a social crime. And also they were like marked by the police or the government because they were political activists. They had like social conscience of the poverty, corruption, lack of education, lack of opportunities, and probably the government was spying on them, have them in a list of dissidents, and probably when the occasion arrived in this very corrupt state, because the government was corrupt, the mayor was corrupt, the police were corrupt, everybody was corrupt in this state, and this was in the Sierra of Guerrero. They are producers of opium, and there are many laboratories for producing heroin, and there is like really was like an state taken by drug traffickers, and these poor students were working there, trying to become teachers, and they happened to this very unfortunate moment that they were trapped by these drug dealers, corrupt politicians, policemen, everything, and they were sentenced to death. And one of the things, still the mystery is what happened with the bodies. Because sometimes they were incinerated, and they found a bone of somebody, but still now nobody knows. Probably they were incinerated in military headquarters because they disappeared completely. And but one of the demands of the parents, they probably know that the children were killed, but they are saying vivos se los llevaron, vivos los queremos. Alive they were taken away, we want them back alive. And that has been becoming like a national movement, but that's very difficult because the government has no intention to juzgarse a sí mismo, to judge itself,
Yeah.
because it's a red of complicities, a network of complicities, and as everybody knows that it's impossible to apply the justice in this case.
Thank you very much. Simon, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, no, almost unseemly. I guess I wanted to just ask Homero that since I live mostly in the United States, you mentioned in your story, in your account of this, Homero, that you know the passage of the buses through Chicago happened with complicity of American authorities. Do you think there is sort of insufficient concentrated cooperation between the American authorities and Mexican authorities, or is the problem that it's at the level of the state, or is it just pure cynicism on both sides, or can that be changed at all?
Well, one of the big problems of drug traffic in Mexico is the market in the United States for drugs. That is they have hundreds of thousands of addicts. Then the day when the Mexican traffickers stop supplying the market, probably you are going to have 100,000 Americans crying in the streets, becoming crazy because of the lack of drugs. That is the big problem, is an approved for market. But the problem sometimes, the mystery is how they cross so many tons of drugs across the American border. And also because the money laundering is in the United States. For example, they say a kilo of cocaine in Chiapas, in the border, in south border of Mexico, is supposed to be like $5,000. When it's in the Mexican border, it's 40,000. When cross the border, the other side is 60,000. And when it's in the market, it's like $100,000. Then this $5,000 kilo of cocaine becomes like $100,000 in the United States, in the streets. Then it's like, it's a big market of drugs in the United States also.
So it's the market economy.
Yeah,
exactly.
Which is actually, yeah, I can believe it. Business as usual.
It is its supply and demand. I mean, as soon as the demand,
yes.
you know, it should be the other way around. Not that people are crying in the streets because they can't get drugs, but if the demand is reduced, then the supply.
And also has been a lack of action by Mr. Obama government, because there has not been, has not shown a policy about this problem.
He's not engaged with
Exactly.
the rest of Latin America at all.
Or Americans,
Yeah.
Americans in this traffic of drugs.
Yeah.
And there are thousands of victims, not only the people killed in Mexico in this traffic, but also thousands of victims in the United States, teenagers that are becoming drug addicts and die every day in the streets. That is the big.
And he should know that's his problem.
It's a Mexican and American problem. And Mexico can cope with the whole problem because there are Russian, Italians, Colombians, Brazilians, American, everybody's in the traffic. And Mexico also is a passage for traffic of women coming from different countries across Mexico. So Latin American women go as trafficked, and also weapons. They are bought in the United States and cross the border.
That's right, yeah.
Yes, it's like, that is very complicated. It's almost a global problem.
We're going to have
sorry
great Trump war.
Yes. I'm sorry to
exactly.
stop you there, but we are running out of time, and I wonder if anyone has any questions from the audience. If so, put your hand up quickly. If not, there's no urgency.
Come on,
No?
class.
No? Oh, okay. Well, that was easy. I was worried that they weren't going to get a chance to ask questions. Yeah, there is one of the sayings is that the drugs go one way and the guns go in the other direction.
Yes,
And if
exactly.
this wasn't happening, then
Yes.
yeah, no, it's very
It's
difficult.
a cycle of violence.
Yeah. No, nothing to ask either. Please. Yes, one here. Yeah.
I have a question for you. Given that we're facing this huge humanitarian crisis in Mexico, did you see this coming? I mean, were we all with our heads in the sand? I mean, what happened? Why are we suffering in Mexico? Like, what's going on? Thousands have disappeared. As you mentioned, women, they're pretty and poor. That's like a death sentence. How is this possible?
Well, we wonder about how is that possible. But in the 1985, when there was a terrible crime, the Camarena case in Mexico, we met a few Colombians living in Mexico, and they said to us, beware, because the Colombianization of Mexico is imminent. These kind of crimes only happen in Colombia, and they were coming there. And then the drug traffickers, the market travels, moves from place to place. And we saw that coming in the 80s, 90s, kidnappings, extortions, traffic of people, and that you see the symptoms. You see that the illness is coming to the country. And also this is possible because corruption. When you have governments that are very corrupt, you have this kind of situation, because they are involved in the problem, not in the solution, but in the problem.
Without actually getting someone else to run the country would be difficult. So even if you had anticipated it, it would be difficult to do anything about.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, go ahead. Thank you. Yeah, no, it's impossible to say what's the solution. It's too big a question. But what is the beginning of an improvement?
Well, some people say about the legalization of drugs. So it has to be also in governments that are very honest, because you create other problems. And if you don't stop the black market, inducing teenagers into drugs or these things, inducing girls into prostitution, forced prostitution, because they are cooking drugs, all these kind of lateral problems, then you have to move. And it has to be an agreement, international agreement. I guess Mexico alone can get find a solution. It has to come to the United States, Europe, also because there's big market in Europe, and mafias also in Europe, in the United States. Then it has to be a coalition of countries fighting against organized crime and legalization of the drugs. But it has to be a health, police, international agreement, and follow, like they have this agreement for issues for war. Probably they can have a coalition to fight organized crime and to have a solution for thousands of teenagers hooking drugs. That sometimes in the United States there are more dead teenagers, people dead by drugs, than in Afghanistan. And that is tragic.
There is no possibility, Homero, of the legalization of drugs nationwide in the United States.
Yes.
Each state is responsible for that.
Exactly.
And Colorado have legalized the use of recreational use of marijuana. Actually, there are a number of states which began with medical use.
Yes.
But beyond marijuana, it's not going to happen. And the legalization of hard drugs will never happen in the United States in my lifetime, possibly not in yours. So that is, a structural
But I
reality.
think
The drug addict has to be considered a sick person and not a criminal.
Well, there is a conversation in American politics, even by Donald Trump, as a matter of fact, actually on exactly that subject.
Yes.
And there is also the beginnings of a really anguished conversation about the appalling incarceration rates in the United States for the possession of trivial amounts of drugs. Actually, that at least is starting. It's a long way to go.
this is a conversation that needs to go on, and I'm just stopping it when it's beginning. I'm
months
afraid.
and
Yes, I'm afraid we do have to stop. But it is good to take from that international pressure and certainly the spread of knowledge internationally about what's going on is a useful thing. So please, you can do that yourselves. Thank you all very much for coming, and please join me in thanking our guests on Aridjis.
Very big thank you to Simon Schama, Homero, Aridjis and Gaby Wood. That massive subject they were just beginning on, we're going to be coming back to later on at 5:15 with three of Mexico's very finest journalists, Yohan Grillo and Alfredo Corchado and Sandra Rodriguez Nieto, so I hope you come back for that. And before then at 4 o'clock, we have the film star Diego Luna and the musician Camilo Lara from Mexrici, who's performing tonight, so I hope you'll come back for that. And we're finishing the day at 6:30 with Thomasina Myers talking about the wonderful work she does. And of course, you know that Oaxaca, her restaurant, is behind this fantastic festival today. So thank you very much for coming. Please come back for more.